Who Does It for a Living Hour 1 is all about listening and observing. It's very easy with a crisis to want to run straight into the fire, but your main job is to assess what's going on and do full due diligence across all exposure points for your client around hour 5. You'll have a clear outlook on what direction you're going to be going in with your response, or by about hour 8 you will know. If you're going to be putting out a statement when you come back on day 2, you'll have then had overnight a time to assess what the public sentiment is like online. If the public sentiment is negative and it's starting to rise, that's when you would tend to put out some form of statement. There are so many variables in that first 48 hours, which is why paying the experts to manage your crisis comms is absolutely critical. This is what the first 48 hours after a PR crisis looks like from someone.
Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're diving into a topic that, well, probably keeps every CEO up at night, right? PR crises.
Oh, absolutely. They can be pretty scary.
Yeah, so we brought in some insights from a top crisis communication expert, someone who really knows their stuff, to help guide us through those first, super critical 48 hours.
Right, because those first 2 days can make or break you.
Exactly. And we're going beyond just the, generic advice here. We want to uncover those, real strategies, those behind-the-scenes things that the pros use, give you a playbook for when it hits the fan.
Because it's one thing to read a textbook, but it's another to, actually be in the trenches.
Exactly. So let's jump in.
All right, so, it's interesting. When that crisis hits, right, most people, their gut reaction is just to, jump into damage control mode.
Right, like statements, press conferences, all hands on deck.
Yeah, the whole 9 yards. But our expert actually suggests hitting the brakes.
Oh, really? So it's less about, putting out fires immediately and more about, stepping back first.
Precisely. That first hour, it's all about information gathering. You need to become a detective, basically.
A detective, huh?
Yeah, scouring social media, news reports, internal comms, anything that can give you a clearer picture of what's happening and how it's being perceived out there.
So it's before you can solve a mystery, you need all the clues.
Right. You don't want to go running off half-cocked.
Okay, that makes sense. But then what? How do you turn all that raw data, all that intel, into a plan of action?
Well, that's where we move into that strategic phase. By hour 5, you should be sifting through all that data, right? Looking for patterns, insights, things that are going to shape your response strategy.
That makes sense. Could you give me an example of how that data might actually inform the strategy?
Absolutely. So imagine a scenario where, let's say, a product recall is necessary.
Okay, yeah, like a faulty part or something.
Yeah, something like that. And analyzing the social media, you discover that the complaints, they're concentrated in a specific region, like, let's say, the Southwest.
Okay, so not nationwide, just the Southwest.
Right, and that's your data pointing to a more targeted response. Maybe a localized statement, additional outreach in that area. It's about making those data-driven decisions, not just reacting emotionally.
So it's not just about what happened, but where it happened and how people are reacting to it?
Exactly. It's all connected.
That's fascinating. But I'm guessing this is also where things get really tricky.
Oh, yeah.
Because now you have to decide, okay, do we issue a public statement or not?
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
That 8th hour, that often becomes a crucial decision point for that public statement.
Wow, the 8th hour. So why is that 8th hour so critical for making that decision?
It's about finding that balance. A premature statement, especially if you don't have all the facts, that can backfire spectacularly. But staying silent for too long, that can also fuel speculation and damage your credibility.
Yeah, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. It's a tightrope walk.
So let me see if I understand this right. So it's less about saying the right thing and more about doing the right things, in those first few hours. Gathering the intel, understanding the scope, and then figuring out how to respond strategically.
You got it. Thoughtful action over knee-jerk reactions.
Okay. So you've listened, you've analyzed, and now you're at that statement decision point. What happens next? Do you just wait and see how things play out?
Not quite. Even if you choose not to issue a statement right away, the work doesn't just, stop. That overnight period, between day 1 and day 2, that's vital.
Okay.
You've had that initial flurry of activity, but now it's time to step back, reassess and see if your initial response, moved the needle in the right direction.
So it's like pressing pause and recalibrating your GPS before you continue on the journey.
Precisely. Are you still on course? Or do you need to, adjust your route? Public sentiment, it can be incredibly dynamic, and especially online. What seemed like a contained issue on day 1, it could just explode overnight.
That raises a really tricky question. What if you decide against a statement on day 1, but then wake up to a full-blown social media firestorm on day 2? Do you scramble to put something out there?
Not necessarily. Remember, it's still about, making those informed decisions, not just panicking. You might decide a statement is needed now, but you craft it strategically.
Yeah.
Right, based on that new data,
Yeah.
not just as a knee-jerk reaction to the pressure.
Okay, so you're constantly monitoring, analyzing, adapting. It sounds exhausting, frankly.
It can be, yeah.
But let's say you decide to make a statement, right? What's the secret sauce? How do you make sure your message actually resonates and doesn't, backfire?
Well, that's where the art of crafting an effective message really comes in. And our expert, he emphasizes 3 key elements: transparency, accountability, and empathy.
Those sound like pretty basic PR principles, though. Is there something more to it in like a crisis situation?
Oh, absolutely. Transparency in a crisis, it goes beyond just, acknowledging the situation.
Okay, so more than just, hey, this happened.
Right. It means owning up to any mistakes. Giving clear and accurate information about what happened and outlining concrete steps to address the issue.
So no hiding behind like vague corporate jargon or empty promises.
Exactly. People see right through that, especially in a crisis when trust is already fragile.
Right. They need the real deal.
Yeah, and accountability is crucial too. It's not enough to just say you're sorry. You need to actually take responsibility for your actions, acknowledge the impact on those who were affected, and demonstrate a genuine commitment to making things right.
So like if your service outage disrupted a bunch of businesses, you wouldn't just apologize. You'd offer credits, compensation, something tangible that shows you understand the real world consequences.
Precisely. You got to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
Yeah, show them you mean it.
And that brings us to empathy. This is where you connect with your audience on a human level. Show them you understand their concerns, their frustrations, even their anger.
I can see how that could be easily overlooked when you're, in the middle of a crisis, trying to protect your brand's image. But you're saying it's actually more important to focus on connecting with people authentically.
It's not about prioritizing your brand over people. It's about recognizing that protecting your brand requires connecting with people authentically.
That's a really interesting perspective. It's almost like a paradigm shift in how we think about crisis communication, right? It's less about control and more about vulnerability and human connection.
You're absolutely right. And it's a shift that can be difficult for organizations to embrace, especially in the heat of the moment.
Oh, I bet.
But it's a shift that's becoming increasingly important in today's world. News travels at lightning speed. Public opinion can make or break your reputation in an instant.
So those first 48 hours, they're not just about managing the immediate fallout. They're about setting the tone for how the entire crisis unfolds, right?
Exactly. If you stumble in those initial stages, it can be incredibly difficult to regain control of the narrative. That's why having a solid crisis communication plan in place beforehand, that's absolutely essential.
So you're saying it's not just about reacting to a crisis, it's about proactively preparing for one. Like having a fire drill for your reputation.
Exactly. You need to identify your key stakeholders, establish clear communication channels, and even, have pre-drafted statements that can be quickly tailored to specific situations.
That makes a lot of sense. So for our listeners out there who are thinking, okay, this all sounds great in theory, but where do I even begin? What would you say are some of the most common mistakes organizations make in those first 48 hours?
Well, as we discussed, one of the biggest pitfalls is reacting too quickly without gathering all the facts. Another is trying to control the narrative instead of authentically engaging with stakeholders.
It's like trying to dam a river, right? Eventually the pressure is going to build and the whole thing could just, erupt with even greater force.
Precisely. And then, of course, there's the mistake of failing to show empathy. If you come across as cold, distant, or dismissive, you're only going to make the situation worse.
You're basically adding fuel to the fire,
Right.
giving people more reasons to be upset and distrustful.
Exactly. And in today's world where everyone has a platform to voice their opinions, that kind of negative sentiment, it can spread like wildfire.
Okay, so we've talked about what to do, but what about what not to do? Are there any absolute no-nos in those first 48 hours?
Definitely. One of the biggest red flags is deleting negative comments on social media.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it might seem tempting, right, to try and silence your critics, but it almost always backfires.
It seems so counterintuitive, though. Why wouldn't you want to remove those negative comments?
Because it looks like you're trying to hide something, which only fuels suspicion and mistrust. It's much better to address those comments directly and transparently, even if it's uncomfortable. Another thing to avoid is engaging in arguments online.
Yeah, that never ends well, does it? It's like trying to wrestle a pig in the mud. You both get dirty and the pig enjoys it.
Exactly. And finally, and this should go without saying, but never lie.
Okay, that seems obvious, but I can imagine that in a high pressure situation there might be a temptation to, downplay the severity of the situation or try to spin the truth a little.
It's understandable, but it's a slippery slope. Lies, even small ones, they erode trust faster than almost anything else. And they always come back to haunt you.
Honesty really is the best policy, even when it's painful. But what about the legal considerations? How do those factor into this whole equation?
That's a great question. And in some cases, your legal team might advise you to limit what you say publicly to avoid potential liability.
So it's like walking a tightrope between being transparent and accountable while also protecting yourself legally.
You got it. That's why it's so important to have a good working relationship with your legal team and to loop them in early on in the crisis management process.
So, to summarize, we've got a lot to consider in those first 48 hours. Listening, analyzing, crafting the message, avoiding pitfalls, and navigating legal concerns. It sounds like a pretty overwhelming task.
Yeah, sounds like crisis management. It's not for the faint of heart.
No, not at all. So many moving parts, decisions to make, and you're under so much pressure.
It can feel like, navigating a minefield for sure. And even with meticulous planning, things rarely go exactly as planned.
Right, that's life.
You'll face unforeseen challenges, maybe make some mistakes along the way and have to deal with the consequences. It's a high stakes game.
So how do you stay grounded and focused, when everything seems like it's spinning out of control?
That's where resilience really comes in. Crisis management. It's not just about, having the perfect playbook.
Right.
It's about the ability to adapt, to learn from those inevitable missteps, and keep moving forward even when the going gets tough.
So it's more like a marathon than a sprint.
Yeah.
It's about pacing yourself, maintaining that clear vision, and having the stamina to go the distance.
That's a great analogy. And ultimately, it's all about protecting your organization's reputation and rebuilding trust with your stakeholders.
We've been discussing this from an organization's perspective, but it strikes me that a lot of these principles, they apply to personal crises as well.
Oh, for sure.
We all face challenging situations in our lives, whether it's a career setback or a health issue or a relationship breakdown.
Absolutely.
Those same principles of pausing before reacting, gathering information, and seeking support, those can be incredibly helpful in navigating those personal challenges.
Couldn't agree more.
So if you find yourself in the middle of a personal storm, remember what we've learned today, right? Take a deep breath, resist that urge to react impulsively, seek guidance from trusted sources, and focus on what you can control.
And don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yeah.
We all need support sometimes,
Yeah.
especially when we're going through difficult times.
That's such an important reminder. Well, on that note, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive. This has been a truly insightful conversation.
I've enjoyed it as well.
It's always fascinating to explore these critical topics and uncover those hidden layers of strategy and insight.
The stuff they don't tell you in the textbooks.
Exactly.
Right over there.
So before we wrap up, let's quickly recap those key takeaways for our listeners.
Right.
First, listen before you react.
Yeah.
Don't jump into damage control mode without first understanding the full scope of the situation. Second, data is your compass. Use the information you gather to shape your response strategy and make informed decisions.
Data-driven decisions.
Exactly. Third, transparency, accountability, and empathy. Those are your guiding principles. Weave those into every message, every action you take. Fourth, avoid those common pitfalls like deleting negative comments or engaging in arguments online. And finally, don't hesitate to seek expert guidance. Crisis management it's complex, and having those seasoned professionals on your side, that can make all the difference.
That's a great summary. And for our listeners, I want to leave you with a thought-provoking question.
All right, it is.
Imagine you're leading the crisis response team for your organization. What are the first 3 steps you would take in those initial 48 hours to protect your reputation?
It's a great question to ponder because, in today's world, it's not a matter of if a crisis will hit, but when.
Exactly. That's why being prepared is so crucial. And hopefully this deep dive has given you some valuable tools and insights to help you navigate those turbulent waters.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of crisis communication. We hope you found it informative, engaging, and maybe even a little bit empowering.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay resilient.